Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man who seemed to treat the laws of physics like polite suggestions and lived as if sleep were a negotiable suggestion. Leonardo da Vinci. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we marvel at Leonardo da Vinci's genius inventions, we need to understand who, or what, we're dealing with. Leonardo wasn't a normal human being. Normal humans sleep, forget things, and sometimes stare at walls. Leonardo did all three at the same time, and then invented a new way to stare at walls more efficiently. Born in 1452 in the tiny Tuscan town of Vinci, Leonardo arrived in the world as an illegitimate child, which in the Renaissance meant you didn't inherit property, but you did inherit trauma. Fortunately, he compensated by developing a brain that acted like it had been plugged directly into the universe's debug mode. While other kids were playing with sticks, Leonardo was sketching swirling water currents and dismantling mechanical toys to see how the gears felt about their life choices. By age 10, he was probably already measuring bird wings and asking uncomfortable questions like, why doesn't the human shoulder rotate like this? Renaissance parents didn't have guidance counselors for that kind of thing. He had almost no formal education, no Latin grammar drills, no Greek philosophy seminars, which should have limited his potential. Instead, it somehow freed him, Leonardo learned, by poking reality with a stick until it confessed its secrets. He taught himself anatomy by cutting open corpses at night. Totally normal behavior. Taught himself physics by dropping objects off heights. Still normal. And taught himself engineering by designing devices that looked suspiciously like OSHA violations in sketch form. His notebooks, thousands of pages long, read like the diary of a man suffering from weaponized curiosity. Inside, you'll find diagrams of flying machines, dissections of eyeballs, sketches of flow dynamics, war machines, botanical studies, and of course a grocery list written in mirror script, because being normal was apparently illegal in Leonardo's mind. Working with Leonardo was chaos. Patrons hired him to paint. And he would. Eventually. But only after inventing 2 musical instruments, redesigning their city's sewage system, and taking a 5-month detour into studying the mechanics of laughter. Finishing paintings was optional. Learning everything was mandatory. You don't get Leonardo's inventions without Leonardo's madness. He wasn't improving the world. He was challenging it to a duel. Every phenomenon, every object, every law of nature was just another opponent to outthink, outsketch, or quietly insult through engineering. And that's how every Leonardo invention begins. With a man who looked at existence and thought, you know what? I can fix this. Leonardo da Vinci had many obsessions, but none were as doomed, majestic, or physically dangerous as his dream of human flight. Birds taunted him. Not intentionally. Birds were simply minding their business. But Leonardo took it personally. He watched them glide effortlessly through the sky, and thought, with complete sincerity, yes, I too shall do this, using medieval materials and leg strength alone. Thus was born the ornithopter, a flying machine powered by the pilot's arms, legs, back, hope, and every muscle group humans were never intended to use simultaneously. It featured massive, beautifully sketched wings, modelled after bats, eagles, and whatever else Leonardo studied while definitely avoiding deadlines. To operate it, you would strap yourself into a wooden frame, essentially a Renaissance torture rack, then flap the wings using ropes, levers, and blind optimism. It's unclear who Leonardo imagined would pilot this device, but based on the required strength, it was either Hercules or someone with thighs powerful enough to crush marble columns. So, basically, no one alive in 1490. And yet, the brilliance behind the madness is undeniable. Leonardo understood lift, drag, centre of gravity, and aerodynamic flow centuries before humans stopped thinking. The sky was the domain of angry gods. His notes weren't the scribbles of a lunatic. They were the building blocks of aeronautical engineering. He observed how birds tilt their wings, how wind behaves, and how turbulence forms. Then he translated it into diagrams so detailed that modern scientists still nod respectfully before adding, "Also, this would kill you instantly." The biggest flaw in the design wasn't Leonardo's math. It was the reality of human anatomy. Humans can barely lift grocery bags on a bad day, let alone flap themselves into the heavens while attached to a wooden death trap. Leonardo underestimated two things: gravity's hatred for the ambitious, the average Florentine's cardio. But even though no one in the Renaissance ever soared majestically with Leonardo's wings, unless you count flying for half a second before making an unscheduled appointment with the ground, the idea was revolutionary. The ornithopter wasn't a failed invention, it was a prophecy. Leonardo didn't build the first successful aircraft, but he sketched the first blueprint that made aviation thinkable. And in the end, that's what genius does. It falls, crashes, and burns, so that 400 years later, someone else can fly. Leonardo da Vinci had a bold idea. If humans were going to fall from great heights anyway, and let's face it, they might as well do it with style and a slightly reduced chance of death. So he invented the world's first known parachute, a pyramidal construction made of tightly woven linen stretched over a wooden frame. Picture a tent. Now imagine someone voluntarily jumping off a tower while wearing that tent. That's Leonardo's parachute. In his notes he confidently wrote, "A man with this device shall throw himself down from any great height without injury." Which is a very poetic way of saying, I have not tested this, but I'm sure it'll be fine. The design itself is impressive. 4 long wooden poles converging at the top, linen stretched like a giant funnel, and a platform underneath for the unfortunate volunteer. In theory, it works. In practice, it requires someone willing to climb a very tall structure during a time when most people fainted from standing too fast. But here's the twist. Leonardo wasn't completely insane. His parachute should have worked, and modern engineers who reconstructed it proved just that. In 2000, a skydiver named Adrian Nicholas made a replica using Renaissance materials and jumped with it, and survived. He described the landing as smooth. A sentence Leonardo would have loved to hear 500 years earlier. Still, we need to appreciate the level of arrogance it takes to design something meant to break your fall from a lethal height before anyone had even considered the words terminal velocity. Renaissance citizens barely trusted ladders. Meanwhile, Leonardo was out here casually suggesting that people yeet themselves off towers with a linen house strapped to their backs. One thing Leonardo understood better than anyone, though, was air resistance. His notes show he recognized that drag slows descent. Long before physics textbooks existed, he even sketched experiments with falling objects to observe how the air cushion behaves. And all of this was done without calculators, wind tunnels, or the basic safety instinct most humans possess. Leonardo's parachute wasn't just a device, it was a statement. What goes up must come down, but maybe not immediately. He imagined a world where humans could escape burning towers, collapsing bridges, or poorly timed engineering experiments. Was it practical for his era? Absolutely not. Was it genius? Without question. As long as you weren't the volunteer testing it. Just when you thought Leonardo's obsession with flight couldn't get any more unhinged, he decided to invent something even more ambitious. The aerial screw. The world's first conceptual helicopter. Picture a giant screw made of linen and wooden ribs, shaped like a spiraling cone. Now imagine 4 Renaissance men standing around it, grabbing poles, and spinning the thing with enough force to lift a platform into the sky. If this sounds like a terrible idea, that's because it absolutely was. The aerial screw is brilliant on paper. Leonardo understood the physics of lift before physics understood the physics of lift. He realized that a spiral structure, rotated quickly, could push air downward and push the machine upward. This is, in fact, how actual helicopters work. The problem? Helicopters require an engine. Renaissance Italy did not have engines. Renaissance Italy barely had reliable socks. Leonardo's solution was manpower, which is hilarious because the average 15th century Florentine had the physical strength of a baguette. These were people who collapsed from walking uphill, yet Leonardo expected them to windmill a 500-pound flying corkscrew fast enough to escape gravity. The math didn't math, the physics didn't physics, and the materials, well, let's just say linen and pinewood are not known for their aerospace durability. But here's the genius. Leonardo did identify the core principle of vertical flight. He had the vision, just not the horsepower. His sketches of the aerial screw include layers of technical detail: load distribution spiral geometry, force transfer through rotational torque airflow compression, all without calculators, textbooks, or safety regulations. This was raw intellect mixed with pure delusion. Even the modern engineers who rebuilt it said the same thing. It works. If you replace humans with a small engine and the entire structure with aerospace-grade materials, which is essentially saying, the idea is genius, the execution is homicide. Still, you have to admire the audacity. Leonardo wasn't content with gliders or wings. He didn't want to imitate birds. He wanted to imitate the sky itself, a machine that rose vertically, hovering above the earth like some divine mechanical dragonfly. It never flew, of course. The only thing the original aerial screw would lift is everyone's eyebrows. But the idea survived. And centuries later, helicopters were born, not from trial and error, but from the imagination of a man who simply refused to let gravity boss him around. Leonardo da Vinci believed that if humans couldn't dominate the skies just yet, they might as well dominate the water. And so he set his sights downward, literally, inventing one of the world's first diving suits. This, of course, was during a time when most people were scared of the ocean, suspicious of fish, and convinced that anything underwater was either a demon or tax-evading mermaid. But Leonardo saw a strategic opportunity. His diving suit was a strange, ambitious creation. Imagine a leather bodysuit stitched together with Renaissance craftsmanship, which is to say, sturdy but mildly alarming. The face mask was fitted with 2 glass eye windows that probably fogged up immediately, ensuring the diver couldn't actually see anything. Breathing was handled through long tubes that ran up to a floating air bell at the surface. If that sounds fragile, that's because it was one strong wave, and suddenly you're not looking at the enemy ship, you're looking at St. Peter. The suit wasn't designed for fun snorkeling trips, it was meant for stealth naval sabotage. Leonardo imagined divers swimming underneath enemy ships, sawing holes in the hull, and slipping away unnoticed while the vessel slowly took on water. Essentially, it was Renaissance special operations, just with more drowning risk and less training. And as usual, Leonardo thought of everything, including a small pouch attached to the front of the suit for tools or possibly stolen snacks. He even included a section in his notes describing how a diver, when feeling threatened, might hide at the sea bottom using a breathing reserve to wait out danger. This was bold, coming from a man whose contemporaries thought the ocean was basically haunted soup. What makes the diving suit so fascinating is how plausible it actually was. Leonardo understood the principles of air supply, pressure, and mobility underwater, long before scuba tanks or regulators existed. The problem wasn't his mind. It was the technology of the time. Leather, glass, and cloth tubes were not ideal materials for extended underwater missions. Most divers would have lasted about 10 minutes before the ocean politely removed them from the gene pool. Still, Leonardo didn't care. He wasn't aiming for practicality. He was aiming for possibility. His diving suit wasn't just an invention. It was a declaration that even the sea, vast and terrifying, was merely another puzzle waiting to be solved. If Leonardo da Vinci had one weakness, it was that he could not resist the urge to redesign warfare. Patron asks for a painting. Leonardo delivers a blueprint for a battlefield nightmare. Patron asks for a sculpture. Leonardo suggests a rotating cannon platform that can erase a small village. The armoured tank was the crown jewel of this habit, an invention so ahead of its time that everyone in the 15th century stared at it like it had just insulted their mother. Picture a gigantic metal tortoise rolling across the battlefield, covered in curved plates of armour and bristling with cannons arranged in a perfect circle. Inside this war turtle sat a team of soldiers cranking gears to move the behemoth forward, which already tells you the first flaw. The Renaissance diet did not prepare anyone for cardio-powered tank operation. Bread, cheese, and occasional plague outbreaks do not build the thighs necessary to propel a mobile death dome uphill. Leonardo's design was brilliant and insane. The sloped armour would deflect arrows, stones, and probably insults. The interior layout protected its crew from enemy fire while allowing them to blast in any direction they pleased. It was essentially a medieval, press this button to ruin everyone's day machine. Anyone facing it on the battlefield would immediately rethink their life choices, their alliances, and possibly their underwear. But here's where Leonardo's genius becomes suspicious. The gear system he drew was backwards, completely inverted. If you built the tank exactly as he drew it, it wouldn't go forward, it wouldn't even spin. It would sit there like an angry armoured biscuit. Historians have debated whether this was an honest mistake or subtle sabotage. Leonardo claimed moral objections to war, despite inventing enough weapons to start several. Some believe he purposely flipped the gears so no warlord could actually use his creation without fixing the plans first. If so, it was the most passive-aggressive anti-war protest in engineering history. Even with the gear problem solved, no medieval blacksmith could have produced enough lightweight, durable metal to build this monster cannon's required gunpowder. Armour required craftsmanship. Wheels required not collapsing. The Renaissance simply didn't have the manufacturing muscle to bring this beast to life. But the idea was terrifyingly real. Leonardo didn't create the first working tank, but he imagined it with such clarity that later engineers essentially said, "Yes, let's do this." 400 years later. His armoured tank wasn't built for battle. It was built for the future, a warning, a prophecy, and a reminder that Leonardo was always several centuries ahead, dragging humanity behind him like a confused toddler. At some point in Leonardo's career, he looked at a normal-sized crossbow and thought, yes, but what if this could level a small town? Thus was born one of his most theatrical inventions, the giant crossbow, also known as the ballista on performance-enhancing drugs. It was roughly the size of a cottage, which is fitting, because firing it once could probably remove several cottages from the map. The thing was 40 feet wide, with limbs so massive they required a full squad of soldiers just to pull the string back. The bow arms were made of laminated wood, reinforced like a battering ram, and the central firing track was long enough to launch bolts the size of telephone poles. Leonardo envisioned it hurling stones, flaming barrels, or oversized bolts into enemy formations, all with a dramatic flair that suggested he cared deeply about battlefield aesthetics. It's easy to imagine the moment, two armies staring each other down, tense silence in the air, and then someone rolls out a crossbow big enough to qualify as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Morale on one side goes up. Morale on the other side packs its bags and leaves. But as with many of Leonardo's inventions, brilliance wrestled with practicality and promptly lost building. This monstrosity would have required more wood than most forests could politely provide, along with carpenters who didn't faint halfway through construction, transporting it to a battlefield. Forget it. You would need a team of oxen, several wagons, and possibly divine intervention. Even if you managed to assemble it, the loading process alone would take so long that your enemies could simply walk around it, take a nap, and come back refreshed. And then there's the firing mechanism. Leonardo imagined a sophisticated tension and release system, but with Renaissance materials, this meant hope the string doesn't snap and remove someone's head. Still, the idea of the giant crossbow is peak Leonardo, equal parts genius, intimidation, and designer chaos. He wanted warfare to be not only effective but visually impressive. If you were going to annihilate your enemies, you might as well do it with the Renaissance equivalent of a siege weapon on steroids. And while no historical record shows this beast ever being built, its presence in Leonardo's notebooks proves something important. the man had no concept of too much. For him, war machines were not merely tools. They were statements. Loud, ridiculous, terrifying statements. Long before anyone invented the phrase rapid fire, Leonardo da Vinci looked at battlefield muskets and decided they were unbearably slow. He was tired of watching soldiers shoot once, reload for 8 hours, and then die before finishing the process. So he invented a device that officially made him the Renaissance's most dangerous efficiency expert. The 33-barreled organ, the first conceptual machine gun. This wasn't a gun so much as a complaint made physical. Leonardo thought, if one musket is good, then 33 muskets fused into one unholy instrument must be better. And thus, he designed a terrifying contraption arranged like a deadly pipe organ, rows of barrels set in a fan shape, able to fire almost simultaneously. The concept was simple. Instead of one soldier firing one shot at a time, multiple soldiers would wheel this monstrosity into position and unleash a volley so overwhelming it would make the enemy question every decision that led them to that battlefield. After firing, the entire set of barrels could be rotated backward while the next preloaded set rotated into place. Reloading became a conveyor belt of chaos. It was brilliant, terrifying, and about as safe as juggling torches in a gunpowder warehouse. The main flaw wasn't Leonardo's ingenuity. It was physics, metallurgy, and the general 15th century tendency for weapons to explode in the user's face. Muskets of the time struggled not to burst from a single shot. Imagine firing 33 at once. The only guaranteed outcome was that someone, somewhere, was losing eyebrows. Then there was the weight. The machine gun was so heavy that it required a small team of soldiers to drag it into battle, and by the time they got it in position, the enemy might have already relocated, eaten lunch, and gone home. Even so, the underlying idea was shockingly modern. Leonardo understood that battlefield dominance wasn't about reloading quicker. It was about not stopping at all. He anticipated the concept of continuous fire centuries before anyone else. His sketches carefully show airflow around the barrels to prevent overheating, recoil distribution, and firing patterns meant to clear infantry lines like sweeping crumbs off a table. It wasn't built in his lifetime, mostly because no one in the Renaissance had the courage or the life insurance to try it. But the thinking behind it paved the way for what we now recognize as machine warfare. Leonardo didn't just speed up battle. He reimagined it, one disastrously unstable volley at a time. In a world where everything depended on horses, transportation, farming, social status, and the occasional dramatic exit, Leonardo da Vinci sat in his workshop and quietly declared war on the entire equine industry. Why rely on a creature with opinions, moods, and a tendency to kick people, when you could build a machine that moved itself? Thus was born the self-propelled cart, humanity's first conceptual automobile, assuming you didn't mind steering a vehicle powered entirely by springs and Renaissance optimism. The cart looked innocent enough. A wooden platform on 3 wheels with gears tucked neatly underneath. But hidden inside was Leonardo's mechanical mischief. A system of coiled springs that, when wound up, unleashed enough stored energy to send the cart rolling forward on its own. No horses, no drivers, just pure Da Vinci chaos on wheels. Historians believe it was originally intended for theatrical productions, designed to roll across the stage carrying props or actors who were either too important or too lazy to walk. But knowing Leonardo, this was just the polite explanation. He absolutely built it as proof that humans could dominate motion without relying on animals. If cars are a symbol of modern independence, this was the 15th century version. A wooden shopping cart that sprinted forward the moment you stopped paying attention. Steering, of course, was where things got interesting. Leonardo's cart used differential gears, a concept so advanced that Renaissance engineers would have stared at it the same way modern people stare at tax documents. It meant the wheels could turn at different speeds during a turn. Revolutionary, genius, completely unnecessary for a wooden vehicle shaped like a breadboard. Modern researchers built a functioning replica, and it actually worked. It moved. It turned. It behaved like a toddler on roller skates, unpredictable but undeniably mobile. Watching it roll across a room is both inspiring and vaguely threatening, like witnessing the birth of a technology that will eventually cause traffic jams and road rage. Leonardo's cart wasn't fast, practical, or even remotely safe. It didn't need to be. It existed for one purpose: to prove that movement didn't require animal power. And in doing so, Leonardo accidentally invented the fundamental principle behind every automobile ever built. The Renaissance world wasn't ready. The roads weren't ready. The horses were definitely not ready. But the future? It had already started rolling. At some point in Leonardo's career, he decided that humans simply weren't dramatic enough. Paintings, fine. Flying machines, interesting. But what the world truly needed, apparently, was a robotic knight, a fully mechanical warrior designed to terrify enemies, impress nobility, and possibly start the Renaissance version of a robot uprising. Leonardo's robot knight was not a sketchy doodle or a half-finished idea. He built the thing. In the late 1490s, during his time in Milan, he constructed a humanoid machine made entirely of gears, pulleys, and metal plates. This mechanical soldier could sit, stand, raise its arms, and move its jaw, which is impressive, considering most actual knights could barely do those things without help from 3 squires and a chiropractor. The design was based on Leonardo's own anatomical studies. He dissected bodies to understand muscles and tendons, then recreated those movements using mechanical analogues. Where a bicep would normally sit, he placed a system of cables. Where joints rotated, he installed precision-engineered gears. Every part of the robot mirrored the human body, just without the complaining, sweating, and susceptibility to plague. Historians believe Leonardo designed the robot partly as entertainment for the Duke of Milan's court. Imagine it: a grand banquet, nobles sipping wine, musicians playing lutes, and then, out of nowhere, a metal knight rises from the floor like it's auditioning for a Renaissance talent show. People must have screamed, applauded, fainted, or all three. Considering this era thought comets were divine warnings, the sight of a mechanical man probably had at least one monk questioning his entire belief system. And yet, the robot was more than a party trick. It was proof that Leonardo understood the mechanics of human motion long before robotics or biomechanics existed. He wasn't just copying muscles, he was engineering movement. His notebooks show shockingly modern concepts: feedback systems, joint articulation, and layered gear assemblies. This wasn't whimsy. It was early automation. Of course, the Duke never used the robot for actual battle. It was far too valuable, too experimental, and far too likely to fall over if a bird sneezed near it. But the fact remains: Leonardo designed the first humanoid robot in history. A walking, talking, gear-driven knight centuries before electricity existed. Leonardo didn't just dream of machines, he dreamed of mechanical life. And that should concern all of us. After surviving plague outbreaks, incompetent leadership, and city layouts that looked like a toddler's scribbles, Leonardo da Vinci came to a bold conclusion: humanity should not be allowed to design its own living spaces. People were messy. Streets were filth canals. Sanitation was optional. And cities, every medieval city, smelled like garlic, sewage, and stress. So Leonardo did what he always did when reality disappointed him. He redesigned it from scratch. Thus emerged his ideal city, a blueprint so advanced and organized that the Renaissance wasn't even remotely ready for it. Leonardo envisioned clean streets, efficient transportation, advanced drainage systems, airy plazas, and multi-level design. Yes, he wanted cities with layers: one for people, one for carts, one for waste and water. He essentially invented the modern concept of zoning centuries before anyone thought, maybe we shouldn't store dead animals next to bakeries. At the heart of Leonardo's vision was the idea of beauty through function. Buildings were symmetrical. Ventilation was intentional. Light entered homes without requiring residents to push aside mouldy curtains. His canals would be redirected and engineered to prevent flooding, eliminating the charming seasonal pastime known as watching your belongings float away. He even proposed wide streets, something unheard of in medieval Europe, where roads were usually one donkey wide and filled with enough hazards to qualify as obstacle courses. Leonardo wanted broad avenues for airflow, sunlight, and easy movement, as if he had magically predicted that one day people would panic when stuck in traffic for more than 3 minutes. But of course there was a problem. Actually, several. First, Leonardo's ideal city required intelligent leadership. That alone doomed it. Renaissance rulers wanted shiny statues and frescoes, not infrastructure improvements. Second, it required money, and Renaissance money was usually spent on wars, weddings, and occasionally extremely unnecessary banquets. Third, his designs were so perfect they were essentially alien technology. Asking 15th century Milan to build this was like asking a medieval baker to whip up a Tesla. So the ideal city remained a dream, ink on paper, centuries ahead of its environment. Modern urban planners, when shown Leonardo's blueprints, react with a mixture of admiration and existential crisis, because everything he proposed, we are still trying to implement now. Grid systems, sewage management, walkable streets, vertical planning. Leonardo solved it all before door hinges were standardized. The tragedy isn't that no one built Leonardo's ideal city, the tragedy is that we still haven't. Leonardo da Vinci had a special talent for looking at ordinary things, like rivers, and deciding they were personally offending him. Medieval armies were constantly slowed down by water crossings, and nothing irritated Leonardo more than inefficiency. So he invented the revolving bridge, a portable, collapsible engineering marvel designed for armies that wanted to move quickly, strike unexpectedly, and probably violate several natural laws in the process. The idea was elegant. A bridge that could be folded, carried, deployed, and removed faster than an enemy could say, "Wait, where did they come from?" Leonardo envisioned a lightweight wooden structure with a clever hinge and pivot system. A squad of soldiers could carry it like a giant ladder, drop it across a river, march over it in perfect formation, then pull it up behind them before anyone figured out what had happened. It was a logistical fever dream, fast, mobile, and slightly rude to any enemy attempting to catch up. This wasn't just a plank with attitude. Leonardo's bridge had counterweights to stabilize the span, locking mechanisms to secure it, and a rotating base that allowed deployment at multiple angles. It was, in essence, the Renaissance version of a tactical, now you see us, now you don't. Armies that used it could appear where they shouldn't be, disappear where they shouldn't disappear, and thoroughly confuse any general who didn't have Leonardo on speed dial. Of course, the brilliance of the revolving bridge also highlighted a major theme in Leonardo's life. He was inventing for people who were not mentally prepared. The average 15th century soldier was already struggling with basic tasks like not dropping their pike. Now imagine asking them to carry a precision-engineered folding bridge without breaking anything or themselves. It's unclear whether Leonardo ever tested this with actual soldiers, but the odds of them assembling it correctly on the first try were roughly equal to the odds of a chicken successfully reading Latin. Still, the revolving bridge was centuries ahead of its time. Modern militaries use deployable bridges based on the exact same principles: portability, speed, and let's cross this before the enemy realizes we shouldn't. Leonardo didn't just propose a new tool, he proposed an entirely new philosophy of movement. But like so many of his inventions, the revolving bridge lived in the purgatory between genius idea and no one here knows how to build that. His patrons wanted flashy weapons, not practical problem-solving devices that required brains and craftsmanship. Yet the bridge remains one of Leonardo's purest works. Clever, efficient, slightly confusing, and completely superior to anything the Renaissance was ready for. By the time Leonardo da Vinci encountered the printing press, Europe was already losing its mind over this new invention that allowed people to mass-produce thoughts without needing a monk who could write faster than the human lifespan. Most scholars celebrated the press as a triumph of knowledge, literacy, and communication. Leonardo, however, looked at it and thought, cute, but it could be better. This is the fundamental difference between Leonardo and everyone else. When normal people see a printing press, they see a machine that makes books. When Leonardo sees a printing press, he sees a disappointing prototype begging to be dismantled, rebuilt, and turned into something that will terrify publishers. First, he took issue with how slow typesetting was. Moving tiny metal letters around by hand, boring, time-consuming, inefficient. Leonardo had watched scribes copy manuscripts in the past. He knew inefficiency when he saw it, so he began sketching mechanisms, gears, rotating platforms and automated type frames that would, in theory, speed up the entire process. The problem? Renaissance printers were not ready. Most of them barely understood the machine they already had. Now here comes Leonardo, suggesting a system that would require a small army of engineers, a stable power source, which did not exist, and the patience of a saint. It was like giving medieval bakers the recipe for a chocolate soufflé and expecting it to go well. Still, Leonardo pushed ahead. He designed a rotational system where prearranged type blocks could be swapped in and out faster, allowing printers to move from one page layout to the next with mechanical precision. He wanted faster throughput, smoother workflows, and, although he never explicitly said it, the total annihilation of slow printing. If Renaissance publishers had adopted Leonardo's upgrades, Europe probably would have entered the information age 2 centuries early. But they didn't. Printers took one look at his beautifully sketched gears, considered their own abilities, and collectively decided, no thank you, we prefer not exploding. And that was the end of it. Leonardo moved on to other things: anatomy, flight, hydraulics, while the printing press chugged along at its steady, unimproved pace. Yet the irony is delicious. Leonardo's ideas foreshadowed automation, rapid typesetting, industrial presses, and even modern newspaper machinery. He didn't just imagine improvements, he predicted entire future industries, all because he thought books deserved better, and because Leonardo, being Leonardo, could not leave anything alone. Long before modern medicine, before surgical gloves, before antibiotics, and before doctors stopped prescribing random herbs and prayers, Leonardo da Vinci walked into anatomy with the casual confidence of a man who didn't fear disease, only ignorance. While most physicians were relying on dusty old texts written centuries earlier, Leonardo was cutting open bodies and discovering the truth for himself, like a Renaissance medical detective who worked exclusively at night for dramatic effect. Leonardo's anatomical studies were not vague drawings. They were mechanical blueprints of the human body. He didn't just record what things looked like, he recorded how they worked. Muscles weren't shapes, they were pulleys. Joints weren't bones, they were hinges. The heart wasn't a symbol of romance, it was a hydraulic pump. He approached the body like an engineer dismantling God's most complicated machine, presumably while whispering, "Okay, but why did you do it like this?" What made Leonardo dangerous wasn't just curiosity, it was accuracy. His drawings of the spine, shoulder joints, and facial muscles are so precise that modern surgeons still admire them. In an era when many doctors still believed that humour imbalances caused nightmares, or that demons caused toothaches, Leonardo's diagrams were centuries ahead. He even discovered how heart valves worked, a discovery Western medicine didn't officially confirm until the 20th century, because, apparently, nobody else thought to look. But the true marvel was Leonardo's mechanical models, what some scholars call his anatomy machines. He designed systems of gears, levers, and cranks to mimic how limbs moved, how lungs expanded, how blood circulated. These weren't toys. They were early prototypes of biomechanics and robotics, born at a time when most people still thought the body contained vapours, and maybe a squirrel. Leonardo wasn't just observing nature, he was reverse engineering it. Of course, the church didn't love this. Dissecting corpses was frowned upon, and dissecting them with enthusiasm was basically a career risk. Leonardo naturally ignored this and continued anyway, Because when something fascinated him, not even the Vatican could stop the man. His anatomy machines weren't built to impress patrons or warlords, they were built to understand existence itself. And maybe, just maybe, to prove that Leonardo da Vinci, a man with no medical degree, understood the human body better than any doctor alive. When Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519, he did not leave behind a simple legacy. He left behind a 13,000-page problem for every historian, scientist and engineer who came after him. Most people die and leave clothes, furniture, maybe a suspicious box under the bed. Leonardo left weapon designs, flight experiments, anatomical diagrams, urban planning blueprints, robotic studies, optics research, and enough half-finished projects to qualify as a Renaissance fire hazard. His notebooks read like the universe downloaded every secret into one man's skull, but only gave him 67 years to write everything down Leonardo clearly needed at least 3 lifetimes. He barely finished a handful of paintings because he was too busy trying to decode the structure of rivers, redesign musical instruments, improve military strategy, and casually reinvent biology. If procrastination were an Olympic sport, he'd have brought home the gold medal, engraved it, redesigned it, and then forgotten where he put it. Yet his true invention wasn't the flying machine, the tank, the robot knight, or the underwater sabotage suit. Leonardo's ultimate creation was a methodology. The idea that the world is a machine, complex, beautiful, flawed, and that anyone curious enough can take it apart and build a better version. Renaissance artists painted saints. Leonardo painted the internal mechanics of reality. What makes him terrifyingly unique is that he wasn't simply ahead of his time, he was ahead of multiple eras. His anatomical studies predicted medical knowledge 3 centuries in advance. His mechanical theories foreshadowed industrial automation. His aviation sketches predated aerodynamics. His city plans resemble modern urban design more than anything in 15th century Europe. Leonardo lived in 1500. But intellectually, he visited the year 2500 and brought back souvenirs. Yet his life ended quietly, without fanfare. No grand recognition, no global headlines, no Renaissance Genius Award. Just a man in a room, surrounded by notebooks no one could understand yet. A mind so large that the world had to grow for centuries just to catch up. And maybe that's the point. Leonardo wasn't making inventions for his own lifetime. He was laying breadcrumbs for the future. Signals, clues, blueprints, meant for a humanity that hadn't evolved enough to use them responsibly. In the end, Leonardo da Vinci didn't just invent machines. He invented possibility, and possibility never dies. It waits. It grows. It returns, very much like Leonardo himself. If you could step into a medieval tournament for even a single heartbeat, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the clang of steel or the roar of the crowd. It would be the colour, a violent explosion of silk, velvet, gold leaf, feathers, embroidery, and heraldic animals so oversized they looked like they were threatening to leap off the fabric and join the fight. Before a single lance shattered, the field was already a battlefield of fashion. And everyone knew it. Tournaments weren't just military exercises. They were carefully staged spectacles of status. Knights didn't ride into the lists merely to prove their strength. They rode to announce themselves. Every piece of clothing, every painted shield, every plume swaying on a helmet was a message. Wealth, lineage, allegiance, personality. And occasionally, yes, I am richer and more sparkly than you, Gregory. Deal with it. A knight's surcoat was the medieval equivalent of a customized luxury suit combined with a billboard. Bright azure for a noble house tied to the sea blood, red for a lineage rumoured to have a temper. Gold thread for those who wanted to remind the peasants watching that they would never ever be that rich. Some knights even added tiny bells or metallic studs, not for protection, but just to jingle dramatically when they walked. Imagine striding into battle, hoping everyone hears you coming. And it wasn't just the knights. Their horses were practically celebrities. Caparisons, full-body cloth coverings, were decorated with everything from embroidered vines to roaring lions. Some were so heavily layered with embellishment that the poor horse underneath looked like it was cosplaying as a moving tapestry. The more elaborate the caparison, the more whispers from the crowd. "Who is that? Which house is that? How many servants did it take to sew that thing?" Even weapons weren't spared the glamour treatment. Shields gleamed with painted beasts, geometric patterns, or religious symbols. Helmets sprouted plumes, wings, dragon crests, and occasionally shapes so ridiculous that even the medieval illuminators looked confused while drawing them. Tournaments were dangerous, yes, but they were also a contest of creativity, a medieval fashion week where the runway could break your ribs. In this world, reputation didn't begin with a victory. It began the moment you stepped into the sun and let the colours speak for you. Before every blow, before every charge, the first battle was always fought with fabric, feathers, and pride. If there was one garment that defined the medieval tournament, it was the surcoat, a long, flowing, often absurdly expensive cloth worn over a knight's armour, and calling it clothing feels almost disrespectful. This thing was a statement, a declaration, and occasionally a cry for attention so loud it could outshine the trumpeters. The surcoat had two primary jobs. First, prevent the sun from turning metal armour into a medieval oven. Second, show off. And the show-off part became its entire personality. Picture a knight riding into the lists with a surcoat trailing behind him like a royal comet. Rich blues dyed with imported woad, deep crimsons pressed from thousands of crushed insects, and gold thread braided in patterns only a noble's wallet could afford. It wasn't just fashion, it was politics, stitched directly into fabric. A man's surcoat told you everything before he even lifted his visor, his family, his alliances, his feuds, and how aggressively he wanted attention that day. Every house had its heraldic colours, and knights displayed them proudly. If your family's symbol was a boar, you wore boar motifs. If it was a lion, congratulations, you probably blended in with half the nobility. But some families had creative heraldry, geese, snails, hedgehogs, and these ended up embroidered in great, glittering detail. Nothing says fear me like a knight charging at full speed with a giant golden goose flapping across his chest. And the material wasn't subtle either. Velvet, silk, brocade, fabrics that absolutely did not belong anywhere near a man wielding a lance. Some surcoats were so heavy with embellishments that they flapped like miniature tents in the wind. Others were cut shorter to avoid tangling in armour joints, giving knights a strangely fashionable silhouette somewhere between armed warrior and runway model mid-twirl. Even more amusing were the knights who treated their surcoat like a moral shield. Religious knights decorated theirs with saints, holy symbols, or entire embroidered Bible verses, as if a beautifully stitched angel on your chest would somehow convince your opponent's lance to miss. But the real drama came from spectators, a knight with a dull or cheap-looking surcoat, whispered insults, a knight with a spectacular one. Marriage prospects suddenly doubled. The surcoat wasn't just outerwear, it was medieval social currency, because in a world where one good hit could knock you into the mud, looking magnificent before falling was half the victory. If the surcoat was the outfit, heraldry was the personality. You couldn't step into a medieval tournament without being visually assaulted by an avalanche of symbols. Lions, eagles, boars, fleur-de-lis, suns, moons, crosses, unicorns, and whatever else a noble family had decided would represent their eternal glory. Heraldry was the medieval version of branding meets astrology, part identity, part reputation, and part, my ancestors apparently liked birds. Every knight entered the lists behind a massive banner, and these banners were designed to be seen from across the field. Bright, bold, and unapologetically dramatic medieval tournaments were chaotic, dusty, and loud, so the solution was simple: make the symbols enormous. Heraldry almost looked like medieval graphic designers trying to yell, "This is Gerald of Gloucester, do not confuse him with Gerald of Gloucester's cousin, who has 2 lions instead of 1. Symbolism mattered. Lions represented courage, even if the knight fainted when his horse sneezed too loudly. Bears meant strength, though some families picked bears because they just thought they looked cool. Eagles were for nobility. Dragons were for families who liked to intimidate neighbours without actually doing anything intimidating. And then, of course, there were snails. Yes, entire noble lineages proudly marched under banners featuring heroic snails. Historians still cannot figure out why. Colours carried meaning too. Blue signalled loyalty. Red declared warrior spirit. Gold meant generosity, or more honestly, we have enough money to waste gold dye on cloth. Black could symbolise wisdom, grief, or simply, my tailor had a sale. Every combination told a story, and these stories were meant to impress the crowd, inspire allies, and terrify rivals. Heraldic shields were painted with the same precision as holy manuscripts. Some were so intricate that they looked like portable stained glass windows strapped to a knight's arm. Others were comically straightforward: one animal, one background colour, and zero hesitation. The message? I am here to hit someone very hard, not to confuse them with multiple design elements. And heraldry wasn't just for knights. Even horses wore heraldic cloth, turning entire teams into coordinated fashion statements. A noble family with matching surcoats, banners, and horse caparisons looked like a medieval boy band arriving on tour, dramatic, unified, and dangerously committed to their aesthetic. In tournaments where dozens of armoured men crashed together, heraldry was the only thing preventing complete visual chaos. It was identity, pride, legacy, and the medieval world's boldest flex. If the surcoat was the outfit and heraldry was the identity, then the shield was the medieval equivalent of a personalised billboard, but one designed to stop spears and look fabulous while doing it. Shields at tournaments weren't the grim, battered slabs you see in battle reenactments. They were masterpieces, art pieces, ego boosters, and sometimes subtle threats disguised as decoration. A knight's shield was usually the first thing the crowd truly saw up close. When he rode forward to salute the stands, the shield angled toward the nobles like a glamorous greeting card. And it mattered. Deeply. A beautifully painted shield wasn't just decoration. It was a public relations campaign. A mud-splattered, chipped, unimpressive shield. That was social death. Most shields were kite shields or heater shields, both offering plenty of surface area for artistic overindulgence. Craftsmen layered pigments, metal leaf, lacquer and varnish, until the entire shield gleamed like a divine relic. Lions snarled across the wood grain. Eagles spread their wings in defiance. Dragons coiled dramatically as if ready to leap out and start an argument. And then there were the more eccentric designs, hands holding swords, flowers with eyes, geometric spirals that made spectators quietly wonder if the painter had gotten into the monastery's wine supply. But shields weren't just painted, they were curated. Some knights commissioned the equivalent of limited edition designs for specific tournaments. A feud with another house? Time to paint a bold, not at all subtle symbol to taunt them, trying to impress a noblewoman watching from the pavilions. Add her family colours discreetly on the edge, attempting to look more pious than the knight next to you. Cover the entire shield in a saint's glowing face and hope no one notices you skipped mass that week. Then came the condition of the shield. A perfectly pristine shield suggested confidence. I don't expect this to get hit. A gently worn shield implied experience. I have survived things you couldn't imagine. A heavily dented shield? That said, I am either very brave or very reckless, possibly both. But in tournaments, dents were often polished or painted over. No one wanted to walk out looking like they lost a fight with a castle door. In the end, a knight's shield wasn't just protection. It was personal brand identity wrapped around planks of wood. It was meant to be seen, admired, feared, and whispered about. Because while a lance could win the match, a magnificent shield won the crowd. If medieval tournaments had a single symbol of glorious impracticality, it was the helmet crest. Those towering, extravagant decorations knights strapped onto their helmets, knowing full well that one strong breeze could knock them sideways. These crests were where fashion, pride, symbolism, and questionable engineering formed an unholy alliance. The basic idea was simple. The taller, brighter, and more absurd your crest, the more attention you commanded. Knights walked into the lists with dragons, wings, bulls, boars, towers, suns, flowers, angelic halos, and sometimes shapes that even medieval scribes couldn't identify. If your crest didn't make at least one squire whisper, "Is that safe?" then clearly you weren't trying hard enough. Some crests were carved from lightweight wood, others moulded from boiled leather, and a few ambitious souls used real metal, because nothing says, "I value aesthetics over spinal comfort," like bolting a steel dragon to your head. These creations were painted in dazzling hues, gilded with gold leaf, decorated with feathers so enormous they looked stolen from mythical birds, and sometimes inlaid with tiny gemstones. A knight charging into battle with a jewel-encrusted unicorn horn on his helmet wasn't ridiculous. He was fashionable. Crests also served as identity amplifiers. A house known for its bravery might choose a roaring lion head. A family famous for its naval victories might wear a carved ship, which must have been deeply confusing for the horse. Some knights even selected crests reflecting their personal quirks. One chronicler mentions a knight who entered a tournament with a literal frying pan attached to his helmet as an inside joke. Another appeared with a cabbage-shaped crest, possibly symbolizing humility or hunger. But the real spectacle came when these decorative sculptures met the wind resistance of a galloping horse. Crests wobbled, flopped, twisted sideways, or sometimes launched themselves into the crowd like medieval frisbees. If a crest survived the entire course intact, the knight received admiration, not for skill, but for balance and luck. Meanwhile, squires spent their days sprinting after runaway feathers like harassed medieval seagulls. Despite their fragility, crests mattered. They were statements of prestige, boldness, and theatrical flair. A knight without a crest looked unfinished. A knight with a magnificent crest looked legendary. And a knight whose crest caught fire from a nearby torch? Well, at least the story lived on. In tournaments built on spectacle, the helmet crest was the crown of chaos, and knights wore it proudly. If helmet crests were the architectural wonders of the tournament, plumes were the fireworks, dramatic, colourful, utterly unnecessary, and adored by everyone. Medieval plumes didn't whisper elegance, they screamed it from across the field. A knight adorned with a towering spray of feathers looked less like a warrior and more like a proud peacock who had decided to pick up jousting as a hobby. Feathers came from every impressive bird medieval Europe could get its hands on. Swans, ostriches, peacocks, herons, cranes. The bigger and rarer the bird, the more respect you commanded. Wearing goose feathers? Fine. Wearing dyed ostrich plumes the size of a broom? Now that was status. Some knights even imported feathers from the Middle East, just to make sure everyone noticed how worldly and wealthy they were before they inevitably got knocked off their horse. Plumes weren't randomly stuck onto helmets. They followed trends, fashions, even seasonal preferences. Two plumes angled backward communicated speed. One long plume straight up announced confidence, or optimism. A cascade of three plumes meant, "My tailor told me this makes my face look thinner." And plumes dyed in intricate gradients meant, "I am here to win the beauty contest disguised as a joust." But plumes had a weakness: physics. Anyone who has ever worn a large hat on a windy day can sympathise. At full gallop, plumes didn't stay elegantly upright. They flapped, snapped, twisted, and occasionally dislodged entirely. Chroniclers write of plumes detaching mid-charge and flying into the audience like startled birds. Imagine being a medieval merchant quietly eating roasted almonds, when suddenly a knight's flaming red ostrich feather smacks you in the face. Still, plumes had a practical side, theoretically. They helped spectators identify knights from afar. This was especially useful during melees, where dozens of armoured men crashed into each other like aggressive cookware. "Look for the one with the giant green plume," someone might shout. But this system collapsed the moment half the plumes fell off, got muddied, or mysteriously transferred to another knight during the chaos. Feathers also carried symbolic meaning. White plumes suggested purity and virtue, even if the wearer was anything but. Scarlet plumes signalled courage, or a desire for attention. Black plumes hinted at solemnity, drama, or a knight trying to look mysterious because he had lost last year and wanted a rebrand. Ultimately, plumes turned every knight into a moving work of art. Were they ridiculous? Absolutely. But they made tournaments unforgettable, flamboyant, and wonderfully theatrical, exactly as medieval nobles intended. If you think knights were overdressed, wait until you see their horses, because medieval tournaments made absolutely sure that even the animals looked like nobility. The horse wasn't just transportation, it was a fashion accessory, a status symbol, a living canvas of heraldry and wealth. And many horses marched into the lists wearing outfits so extravagant that modern runway designers would weep with envy. Enter the caparison, a long, flowing cloth draped over the horse's entire body, often reaching nearly to the ground. These things turned horses into galloping tapestries, made from velvet, silk, or brocade, materials horses definitely did not care about. They were embroidered, painted, and embellished until the poor animal looked like it was starring in a royal pageant, rather than preparing to dodge flying splinters from shattered lances. A caparison wasn't optional. It was a knight's visual introduction, magnified through horsepower. If your surcoat displayed your colours and your shield showed your symbol, the caparison shouted it from the rooftops. Some were decorated with massive roaring lions, or repeating patterns of fleur-de-lis the size of dinner plates. Others featured geometric designs so dizzying that spectators probably saw double when the horse galloped by. And because medieval nobility had a flair for the dramatic, they added bells. Yes, tiny bells stitched along the edges, so the knight and his horse jingled majestically with every step. If you weren't heard before you were seen, you clearly weren't wealthy enough. Then there was the problem of heat. Horses run hot. Wrapping them in several kilograms of embroidered fabric was, objectively, insane. Yet nobles persisted. Chroniclers mention horses sweating through their expensive outfits, while knights bragged about how many seamstresses worked on them. The horses, of course, remained silent, mainly because complaining was not an option. The caparison also had a tactical element. It concealed the horse's muscles and movement. In a melee, this could confuse opponents about the horse's next move. But let's be honest. The tactical value was about 2%. The remaining 98% was pure vanity. Some caparisons included matching plumes, tassels, or decorative headpieces called chamfrons, making the horse look like a noble creature summoned from an illuminated manuscript. A fully dressed knight on a fully dressed horse created a spectacle so majestic that the crowd didn't just cheer, they gasped. In the medieval tournament arena, appearance was everything, and if you showed up with a plain horse, people noticed, and not kindly, because in this world of silk, colour and glory, your horse was part of your legend, and it deserved to shine just as much as you did. Before knights thundered down the lists with lances lowered, they dressed for the occasion, and dressed is absolutely the correct word. Tournament armour was not the same battered practical iron worn in real battles. No, jousting armour was luxury armour, crafted with the same seriousness medieval nobles applied to negotiating marriages, feuds, and questionable religious relic purchases. Tournament armour evolved into its own art form. Knights wore reinforced breastplates, thick pauldrons, and specialised grandguards, large plates attached to the left shoulder to absorb the disastrous moment another man's lance tried to turn your ribs into medieval confetti. But the armour wasn't only about protection, it was about prestige. Every curve of steel was polished until it reflected sunlight like a mirror. Imagine dozens of knights glimmering so intensely in the morning sun that spectators were forced to squint like they were staring at holy relics. Then came the decorative elements, because plain armour simply wasn't enough. Engravers carved swirling vines, leaping stags, snarling lions, or intricate knotwork across the plates. Gold and silver inlays traced family symbols, religious motifs, or abstract patterns that said, "Yes, I am wealthy enough to pay an artisan 10 days' wages to decorate my elbow." Some armour even featured etched prayers, just in case divine intervention felt like helping on tournament day. Every piece had flair. The vambraces on the forearms were often decorated with ornate ridges or scalloped edges. Gauntlets gleamed with embossed symbols. Greaves and sabatons, leg and foot armour, sometimes sported pointed toes so fashionable and so dangerously trippable that modern historians still wonder how knights didn't topple like armoured ducks. But the real centrepiece? The helm. Tournament helms were thicker, rounder, heavier, and about as breathable as an iron oven. Knights peered through narrow slits that offered visibility comparable to wearing a mailbox on your head. Yet these helms were also canvases for artistry, gilded trim, painted visors, embossed crowns, and of course the bolt-on madness of crests and plumes. Despite all this decorative bravado, tournament armour was shockingly practical in one way: it prevented death. Tournaments were dangerous. Lances splintered, shields shattered, horses collided, and knights occasionally forgot to turn left instead of right. A well-made suit of armour could save a life, and help its wearer look magnificent while nearly losing it. In the medieval tournament, armour wasn't just protection. It was elegance, identity, ego, and craftsmanship fused into steel. The ultimate blend of style and survival. A medieval tournament wasn't merely a contest of strength or skill. It was a public theatre, a grand festival where clothing, armour, fabrics, feathers, horses, banners, and egos all collided in one enormous display of aristocratic pageantry. If the Middle Ages had award shows, this was the equivalent of the Oscars, Met Gala, and a demolition derby rolled into one. Before the jousts even began, crowds gathered not to watch combat, but to inspect the fashion parade. Nobles sat in pavilions under embroidered canopies, squinting with judgmental enthusiasm. Ladies of high birth whispered about which knight had updated his heraldic colours, whose surcoat looked suspiciously less expensive this year, and who had clearly hired a new tailor because his silhouette was suddenly much improved. Medieval gossip was ruthless, and while the nobles gossiped, the commoners roared their approval for anything shiny. A knight could simply ride past with sunlight bouncing off his polished breastplate, and peasants would cheer like they'd just witnessed a miracle. They didn't care if the crest was symbolic, meaningful, or historically significant. They cared that it looked enormous and vaguely dangerous. Music filled the air. Trumpeters signalled each entrance, turning the lists into a catwalk with an enthusiastic brass soundtrack. Heralds announced knights with dramatic flair. "Behold Sir Edmund of Radnor, whose valour is only matched by his extremely large plume." Banners waved, caparisons fluttered, bells jingled. Every sense was assaulted. This wasn't accidental. Tournaments were designed for maximum spectacle. Lords used them to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and showcase their wealth. Knights used them to advertise themselves. Literally. A magnificent outfit could win the admiration of a noblewoman, the respect of an influential lord, or at the very least, the envy of every other knight sweating inside poorly ventilated armour. Even the danger contributed to the glamour. A perfectly executed joust was thrilling, but so was a spectacular collision. Crowds gasped, ladies clutched their veils, and the announcers, if medieval people had announcers, would have replayed the moment in slow motion. Splintered lances flying through the air looked like glitter thrown by a very aggressive party planner. And when the victor emerged, plumes intact, surcoat shimmering, shield shining, he didn't just win a tournament, he won a moment of medieval immortality. His fashion, his armour, his colours, all would be remembered, copied, admired. Because in medieval tournaments, glory wasn't only earned through skill, it was worn. For most of the year, Rome was obsessed with order, hierarchy, discipline, respectability. Every Roman knew their place. Masters commanded, slaves obeyed, senators lectured, and everyone tried to look more serious than the person next to them. But then, every December, something extraordinary happened. The social machinery of the empire screeched to a halt, took a deep breath, and threw itself straight into joyful anarchy. This was Saturnalia, the one time of year when Rome officially stopped pretending it was civilized. The festival began on the 17th day of December, but in truth, the Romans were mentally preparing for it far earlier. As soon as the first decorations appeared, green wreaths, pine boughs, and small figurines of Saturn, people knew that the rules were about to melt like butter in the Mediterranean sun shops, and courts closed. Work evaporated, responsibilities dissolved. Even the gods, it was said, loosened their belts to enjoy the chaos. And chaos it was. Saturnalia wasn't just a holiday. It was a temporary revolution. All the strict lines that usually kept Roman society glued together suddenly blurred. Slaves sat at the same tables as their masters. Children mocked their fathers. Masters served food to the enslaved. And for once, the enslaved could speak freely, sometimes very freely, much to the horror and entertainment of the household. People roamed the streets wearing vivid caps called pilae, symbols of freedom usually reserved for freedmen. That alone was wild enough. But add the drinking, the singing, the public jokes, and the general shortage of inhibitions, and you had something resembling an ancient block party that somehow lasted for days. Rome became a city of noise, dice clacking on stone tables, musicians blasting flutes in alleyways, neighbours shouting greetings from balconies while holding amphorae of wine, strangers exchanged gifts, wax figurines, candles, pastries shaped in ways that were definitely not meant for children. Everyone gambled openly, even though gambling was usually banned. During Saturnalia, nothing was banned. Or rather, everything embarrassing was encouraged. But the most striking feature of all was the mood. The constant tension of Roman life, political, social, economic, vanished like smoke. In its place came something rare: laughter. Genuine, unrestrained laughter rolling through the streets like a warm breeze. For one glorious week, Rome let go. It forgot hierarchy, forgot seriousness, forgot itself. And in the heart of all that joyful disorder, Saturn reigned. Not with authority, but with celebration. If there was one tradition that defined Saturnalia, one that made conservative Romans clutch their togas in moral panic, it was the role reversal. For this brief window of time, the entire hierarchy of Rome flipped upside down like a poorly managed chariot. Masters became servants. Servants became masters. And everyone pretended this was totally normal and not mildly terrifying for the elite. The moment Saturnalia began, households across Rome performed a symbolic act. The slaves' collars were removed. Enslaved men and women exchanged their usual work clothes for brighter garments, sometimes even borrowing their masters' cast-off finery. Tunics dyed brilliant colours, cloaks with expensive edging, or sandals so nice they'd never be allowed near them the rest of the year. And of course everyone, slaves and free citizens alike, wore the pileus, the soft conical cap of freedom. For 1 week, the entire empire walked around wearing hats that essentially said, "Today, nobody is the boss." The inversion didn't stop at clothing. In private homes, the master didn't just sit at the table. He served it. That meant pouring wine with the delicate skill of someone terrified of spilling it. It meant handing out food. It meant watching as the slaves, usually silent, obedient, invisible, now sprawled on couches like emperors, critiquing the cooking and making jokes no one dared utter during the rest of the year, and the jokes came freely. Saturnalia was the only time slaves could insult their masters without punishment. Some kept it playful. Others got... Creative Romans wrote about enslaved people who recited entire comedic monologues about their owners' bad habits, stinginess, infidelity, or famously terrible singing voices in the masters. They had to laugh, or at least pretend to. The streets echoed the same reversal. A poor man might be elected Saturnalicius Princeps, the king of Saturnalia, chosen to boss everyone around for the day with foolish orders and ridiculous commands. Sing, dance, drink, Bring me more food! The real king of Saturnalia wasn't powerful. He was chaotic. His rule was less about authority and more about mischief. To outsiders, this must have looked like anarchy disguised as a holiday. But Romans believed this ritual chaos renewed the social order. By letting the lower ranks mock the higher, Saturnalia allowed pressure to escape the system. For 1 week, Rome played at equality. It was messy, loud, undignified, and strangely healing. If everyday Roman meals were orderly, rationed, and governed by social etiquette, Saturnalia meals were the complete opposite: chaotic, overflowing, and spectacularly indulgent. Feasting wasn't just a part of the festival, it was its beating heart. For 7 straight days, Rome essentially declared war on moderation. The atmosphere began in the kitchens, where cooks, usually enslaved and overworked, suddenly took centre stage. Cauldrons steamed, ovens roared, and every pantry was ransacked like the city was preparing for a siege, except the goal was overeating rather than survival. Even the simplest households scraped together ingredients for at least one good feast. Rich households, though? They went full imperial drama. Tables groaned under dishes that looked like edible architecture. Roasted piglets glazed with honey, sausages braided like garlands, chickpea stews seasoned so heavily with herbs that they practically glowed green, fried pastries dusted in powdered sugar, dates stuffed with almonds, and massive platters piled with figs, pears, and pomegranates. And this was before the wine started flowing. Wine wasn't served politely. Saturnalia was about forgetting restraint, so pitchers were passed endlessly, cups were oversized, and mixing your wine with too much water, normally a mark of good manners, was basically a sign of weakness. People toasted to Saturn, to each other, to the city, to the gods, to absolutely nothing in particular. Someone sneezed, toast. Someone dropped their cup, another toast, but the real twist came from the seating arrangement. In elite households, the slaves, normally banned from reclining at the table, were invited to join the feast as equals. They lounged on the cushioned couches, sampling the finest dishes. Meanwhile, their masters carried trays, poured wine, and fetched extra bread. It wasn't just symbolic, it was intentionally humbling, and it made the feasts unpredictable. Masters stumbled around with plates, trying desperately not to spill sauces or drop amphorae on anyone's lap. The slaves, emboldened by tradition and wine, critiqued the food with theatrical seriousness. A little too salty, one might say. Not enough pepper, another would add, while the master nodded obediently like a chastised apprentice chef. Feasting spilled into the streets. Pop-up vendors fried honey cakes. Musicians played flutes and drums. Crowds danced with greasy fingers, and the entire city smelled like roasted meat and warm bread. Rome became one giant dining hall where no one counted calories, coins, or consequences. For 1 week, gluttony wasn't a vice, it was a civic duty, and Rome performed it with gusto. If Saturnalia had a softer, sweeter side, something that balanced the chaos, drinking, and roasted animals, it was the tradition of gift-giving, and Rome took this tradition just as seriously as it took its feasting, meaning with enthusiasm, creativity, and absolutely zero sense of moderation. If you think modern holiday shopping gets chaotic, imagine it without malls, credit cards, or price tags. But with thousands of Romans yelling in marketplaces after too much wine, the most common Saturnalia gifts were simple. Candles, symbolizing light in the darkest season of the year. They ranged from tiny wax tapers to massive torches that looked like someone accidentally wrapped a small tree in beeswax. People also exchanged sigillaria, small clay or wax figurines shaped like gods, animals, children, or occasionally things that made Roman parents cough awkwardly and pretend not to notice. Friends, neighbours, lovers, clients, and even the enslaved exchanged these miniature gifts. Some were humorous, others deeply symbolic. A wax lion, strength, a clay dove, peace, a tiny figurine shaped like your friend's pet, thoughtful. A figurine shaped like your friend's bald spot. That was the spirit of Saturnalia, teasing without consequence. But not all gifts were small. Wealthy Romans used Saturnalia as the perfect excuse to show off. They handed out silver cups, embroidered garments, exotic fruits, perfume bottles, writing tablets, and chests of rare spices. Some even gifted slaves temporary bonuses to splurge on gambling or drinks, a brief window where generosity and recklessness walked hand in hand. Still, the real joy came from novelty. Romans adored weird gifts. One writer complains about receiving a set of miniature bronze cows for no reason. Another mentions a friend who gifted a single shoe, claiming the other would arrive next Saturnalia. Prank gifts were encouraged. The more confusing the present, the better the reaction. Markets buzzed with shoppers grabbing last-minute trinkets. Stalls sold little sculptures, carved dice, jewellery, perfumes, pastries, and anything small enough to carry yet interesting enough to avoid the dreaded reaction. "Oh, thank you. What is it?" Sellers shouted over each other. Children tugged at their parents' tunics begging for toys, and pickpockets enjoyed their own version of gift collection. But the true magic wasn't the objects themselves, it was the mood. Saturnalia gifts weren't about duty or show, they were about shared joy. For 1 week, Romans remembered each other. They laughed, exchanged tokens of affection or mischief, and strengthened bonds across classes and households. In a culture famous for its rigid seriousness, Saturnalia gave Rome permission to be warm, generous, and delightfully silly. If you wanted to witness Rome at its most uninhibited, chaotic, and gleefully irresponsible, you didn't go to the feasts. You went to the gaming tables. Saturnalia unleashed something deep in the Roman soul, a primal urge to gamble. The same senators who passed solemn laws banning gambling the rest of the year suddenly found themselves hunched over dice boards, shouting like drunken gladiators. During Saturnalia, all gambling bans vanished, and Rome collectively declared, "Fortune favours the foolish." The streets became casinos without ceilings. Dice clattered everywhere, on marble floors, wooden stalls, dusty doorsteps, tavern counters, and even temple steps, much to the disapproval of priests, who pretended not to see. People crowded around improvised gaming mats, cheering and jeering as fortunes changed in minutes. Children gambled with nuts, adults gambled with coins, and a few overconfident souls gambled with things they would regret losing the next morning. The most beloved game was Alea, a simple but addictive dice game. Romans threw knucklebones or six-sided dice with all the dramatic energy of modern poker champions. A perfect throw brought instant bragging rights. A bad throw brought groans, laughter, and theatrical despair. Some players developed rituals for luck, kissing the dice, whispering to them, tapping them on statues of Saturn, or even blowing on them while praying for divine assistance. Saturn, god of liberation, must have been exhausted. But gambling wasn't limited to dice. Romans played tabula, an ancestor of backgammon, ludus duodecim scriptorum, card-like games with painted tiles, and competitive drinking games that definitely counted as gambling when wagers involved personal dignity. During Saturnalia, even respectable matrons, normally models of restraint, were known to join games with delighted mischief, smirking as they beat their husbands at dice in front of the household slaves. The enslaved, for once, were allowed to gamble openly too. Their masters even gave them coins specifically to lose, which they dutifully tried not to do, and when enslaved gamblers won against their own masters, the cheers could shake the walls. It was a rare, precious moment where luck ignored status. Of course, with all this chaos, someone always tried to cheat. Loaded dice appeared. People switched pieces when no one was watching. Arguments flared, but Saturnalia had its own code. Cheating was wrong, unless you were clever enough not to get caught. That, Romans said, was part of the fun. Gambling during Saturnalia wasn't just entertainment, it was catharsis. A brief, thrilling rebellion against Rome's normally suffocating seriousness. For one glorious week, everyone, from senator to slave, rolled the same dice. And for once, fortune smiled equally. If the feasts and gambling filled Roman homes with excitement, the streets of Rome during Saturnalia were an entirely different beast. The city transformed into a living carnival, loud, unpredictable, overflowing with energy, and absolutely impossible to escape. Saturnalia wasn't something you celebrated quietly. It was something that happened to you, whether you liked it or not. From dawn until deep into the night, every alley, forum, bathhouse, and courtyard pulsed with activity. Musicians wandered through the city playing flutes, drums, lyres, and anything else that could produce sound. Preferably loud sound groups formed spontaneous parades. Children ran around with clay figurines. Revellers waved evergreen branches and shouted "Io Saturnalia" at strangers the way modern people shout "Happy New Year" after far too much champagne. And then there were the costumes. Romans didn't dress as animals or mythical creatures. This wasn't a masquerade, but they did dress strangely. People wore colourful clothing, mismatched patterns, and sometimes exaggerated wigs or humorous imitations of stereotypes. Others wrapped themselves in garlands or painted their faces. Saturnalia was not the time for dignity. Even the normally rigid Roman manners evaporated. Strangers chatted freely. Neighbours laughed together. People greeted each other as equals, even if one lived in a mansion and the other lived in a tenement. Saturnalia flattened the social pyramid into a crowded, noisy, joyful, city-wide party. For a few days, Rome felt less like the capital of an empire and more like a village celebrating a good harvest. Public drinking was everywhere. Taverns overflowed onto the streets. Amphorae of wine circulated like communal treasures. People toasted Saturn, toasted each other, toasted the sky, toasted the ground. Anything that didn't move too fast. And if someone did move too fast, they were probably running to join the next round of dice games. Street performers thrived during this week. Jugglers, dancers, fire-breathers, comedians, and questionable acrobats all competed for attention. Some were genuinely talented. Others were so terrible that they attracted crowds purely out of fascination. Either way, no one complained. Saturnalia celebrated the spirit of participation over quality. If you were enthusiastic, you were welcome. Nightfall didn't calm the chaos. Instead, torches illuminated the streets, casting flickering golden light across parties that continued until exhaustion or dawn, whichever arrived first. Music blended with laughter, and the city hummed like a single massive organism set free from restraint. This was Rome without rules, without stiffness, without hierarchy. For 1 week, the empire became human, messy, noisy, warm, alive. If Saturnalia had a mascot, someone who embodied the pure, undiluted spirit of mischief, it was the Saturnalicious Princeps, the so-called Lord of Misrule. This was the temporary king chosen to preside over the festival, and Rome took this tradition so seriously that they deliberately picked the most unlikely candidate possible. A poor man, a household slave, a class clown, or even a shy bookkeeper who had never raised his voice in public. Anyone could become the ruler of Rome's wildest week. The Lord of Misrule wasn't chosen because he was dignified, noble, or wise. In fact, those qualities immediately disqualified you. The whole point was inversion, the lowest-ranking person suddenly giving orders to everyone else, including their masters, and not sensible orders. Oh no, the Lord of Misrule specialized in absurdity. His commands were intentionally chaotic, humorous, or borderline impossible. Sing a song in the voice of a farm animal. Pour wine for that slave over there, faster. Dance until you fall over. Declare your deep personal fear of geese. And Romans obeyed. They had to obey. Tradition demanded it. Even a stern paterfamilias, normally the feared head of the household, had to salute this temporary joker king and follow his foolish decrees. Imagine a respected senator being told to hop around the room like a drunk grasshopper, while a slave leaned back on a couch eating honey cakes that was Saturnalia's glory. The Lord of Misrule wore the symbolic outfit of reversed authority. Bright clothing, a wreath of greenery, and a sense of confidence he absolutely did not possess any of the other 358 days of the year. He held mock audiences, gave ridiculous speeches, and even punished people with silly forfeits, embarrassing dances, playful confessions, or drinking extra wine as penance. Some households took this further, staging mock trials where the Lord of Misrule prosecuted family members for fake crimes like being too serious, snoring like a dying boar, or hoarding the good figs. Everyone attended, everyone laughed, and the accused usually ended up performing a hilarious task to earn forgiveness. This tradition wasn't random silliness, it was emotional release. For slaves, it was a rare taste of power. For masters, it was a reminder not to take themselves too seriously. For the whole household, it was a shared ritual of laughter. And when Saturnalia ended, the Lord of Misrule returned quietly to obscurity. But for one shining, chaotic week, he ruled Rome with jokes instead of laws, and Rome loved him for it. To understand why Saturnalia was so wild, so chaotic, and so unlike anything else in Roman life, you have to understand Saturn himself, the ancient god at the centre of the festival. Saturn wasn't a distant, dignified deity who liked formal rituals and quiet incense offerings. No. Saturn was a god of old freedom, of a mythical age before laws, kings, and the endless seriousness that Rome later became obsessed with. He embodied a dream of a world where no one ruled and no one obeyed. According to Roman myth, Saturn once ruled during the Golden Age, a time when humans lived without fear, hunger, or hierarchy. No masters, no slaves, no war, no poverty. People worked the land together, shared the harvest, and lived in complete harmony. Saturn taught them agriculture, generosity, and the joy of living without oppression. It was the ultimate good old days story, the kind grandparents tell, except this time the grandparents were immortal. But when Jupiter dethroned Saturn, that perfect age ended. Saturn fled, and eventually found refuge in Italy, where he brought peace, abundance, and civilization to early tribes. The Romans honoured him not with solemn reverence, but with joyful remembrance of that lost freedom. Saturnalia wasn't just a party. It was a symbolic return to the Golden Age. That's why everything reversed. Why the enslaved dined with masters. Why gambling became legal. Why dignity collapsed. Why seriousness evaporated. During Saturnalia, Romans believed Saturn temporarily broke free from his mythical chains beneath the Capitoline Temple and walked among them again, smiling at the beautiful chaos. The festival's core rituals reflected this mythic nostalgia. The small woolen bindings normally tied around Saturn's statue were removed, representing liberation. His temple overflowed with worshippers, bringing offerings of bread, honey, and first fruits, symbols of simple, communal plenty. Priests and citizens alike sang hymns, calling for renewal, abundance, and the softening of the social order. Even the gift-giving had sacred undertones. Wax figurines represented sacrifices once offered to Saturn, a gentler substitution that kept the spirit without the bloodshed. Candles symbolized returning light, hope, and the rebirth of the sun at winter's turning point. To Romans, the laughter, gambling, wine, and jokes weren't disrespectful. They were acts of devotion. Saturn didn't want solemnity. He wanted the world as it had been in the beginning, free, equal, abundant, and full of life. For 1 week, Rome remembered that dream, and even the gods approved. When the final day of Saturnalia ended, Rome faced a familiar but dreadful moment, the moment when the music stopped, the wine jugs ran dry, and the city had to remember how to behave again. It was not a graceful transition. Imagine an entire empire waking up from the same glorious week-long party, looking at the mess around them, and collectively asking, "What have we done?" First came the emotional whiplash. 1 day earlier, slaves reclined on couches like emperors, and masters fetched them figs. Dice clattered in every alley, people wore bright caps, drank until they forgot their own names, and shouted, "Io Saturnalia!" at strangers. But as dawn broke after the final night, the festival atmosphere evaporated like spilled wine on sun-baked stone. The pileus caps came off. The masters reclaimed their authority. The enslaved quietly returned to their roles. The social pyramid reassembled itself with mechanical precision, but it wasn't bitter. Saturnalia didn't end in resentment. It ended in reflection. Masters had seen their enslaved workers laugh, joke, criticize, and dine with them. Some historians argue Saturnalia softened household tensions, breaking the emotional distance that dominated Roman private life. For a brief window, humanity had peeked through the cracks of hierarchy. Still, the physical aftermath was something. Streets littered with wilted garlands, tavern floors sticky with spilled wine, dice abandoned everywhere like strange little fossils, marketplace stalls half empty after a week of frantic gift buying, flute players asleep against walls, a few unlucky souls snoring on benches, still wearing last night's wreaths. Then came the quiet return to order. The courts reopened, shops unlocked, senators returned to the forum, pretending they had not spent the past week singing off-key drinking songs, bathhouses filled with people recovering from the festival with long soaks and embarrassed storytelling. Parents tried to convince children that no, life would not remain this fun forever. Religious officials rebound the statue of Saturn with woolen ropes, symbolically returning the god to his peaceful rest beneath the Capitoline temple. The Golden Age retreated. Structure reclaimed the city. But the warmth of the celebration lingered, like the last glow of a fading fire. And that was the beauty of Saturnalia. It ended so that Romans would crave it again. A single week of freedom, laughter, disorder, and kindness, followed by the comforting, if sometimes oppressive, return of normal life. It reminded Rome that humanity mattered just as much as discipline. Saturnalia's chaos faded, but its joy stayed in the Roman heart until next year, waiting to burst free again. Valeria Messalina did not grow up in an ordinary Roman household. She was born into the Claudian dynasty, one of the most elite, intertwined and dangerously influential families in the empire. Her childhood wasn't defined by toys or games. It was shaped by whispered conspiracies, political dinners, and the constant awareness that every relative around her had enemies, agendas, or both. When other children learned to walk, Messalina learned to watch. When others learned to speak, she learned to strategize. The imperial family was her playground and also her battlefield. Her lineage guaranteed luxury. Marble villas, silk cushions, tutors who drilled her in literature, philosophy, and the art of appearing innocent while calculating everything. But Roman aristocracy also guaranteed exposure to the darker side of power. Jealousy, rivalry, and the quiet fear that the wrong alliance could destroy an entire bloodline. Messalina absorbed all of it. She saw how quickly reputations changed, how rumors could ruin a senator, and how survival in Rome required a talent for influence. At a shockingly young age, she was connected to the emperor through blood and marriage lines long before she ever stepped into the palace as an adult. Her cousin was the young Gaius, better known as Caligula, a boy whose childhood temper tantrums were early warning signs of the unhinged reign to come. Family gatherings weren't warm. They were pressure cookers, with ambitious relatives smiling politely while imagining each other's funerals. Messalina grew up studying them all, and if Rome taught her one thing early, it was this. Power was the ultimate currency, and beauty was a powerful tool. Ancient writers, biased or not, describe Messalina as striking, dark-haired, charismatic, and dangerously magnetic. She wasn't merely attractive, she possessed presence. The kind that made people look twice. The kind that, in Rome, could be weaponized by her teenage years. She understood exactly where she stood in the imperial web. She was valuable, politically, socially, symbolically. And valuable people were never left alone for long. So when the imperial family arranged her marriage to Claudius, a man older, awkward, scholarly, and constantly dismissed by his kin, Messalina didn't flinch. She understood what the marriage meant: alliance, access, influence. She might not have known she would become empress one day, but she certainly knew she was stepping closer to the throne Rome had crafted her. Now it was time for her to step into Rome's centre stage, and the empire had no idea what storm it had just invited into the palace walls. When Messalina married Claudius, the match was not a love story. It was a calculated political arrangement wrapped in silk and ceremony. Claudius, decades older than her, was the awkward scholar of the Julio-Claudian clan. He limped. He stuttered. His family mocked him behind his back, calling him slow, weak or harmless. But what the imperial household failed to grasp was that harmless people sometimes survive long enough to become emperor. And Messalina, even in her youth, recognized potential when she saw it. Their marriage began before Claudius ever dreamed of the throne. At the time, he was simply a respected historian, a polite aristocrat with a quiet nature, and, importantly, someone unlikely to overshadow a politically ambitious bride. Messalina entered the union with clear eyes. She wasn't marrying a military hero. She wasn't marrying a feared politician. She was marrying a door, one that opened straight into the palace. Still, Claudius was no fool. He adored his young wife with an earnestness that bordered on worship. Messalina, for her part, played the role of dutiful spouse with flawless performance, demure glances, gentle smiles, loyalty displayed for the public. And Rome bought it. She gave Claudius 2 children, Octavia and Britannicus, cementing her position as the mother of an imperial bloodline long before Claudius himself realized how important that would become. Then fate shifted. Caligula fell to an assassin's blade in the chaotic aftermath of a palace conspiracy, and Claudius, hidden behind a curtain, terrified, confused, was dragged out and proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard. Messalina did not faint or protest. She watched opportunity unfurl before her like a golden tapestry. Overnight, she became Empress of Rome. But while Claudius stepped into power reluctantly, Messalina embraced it with shocking speed. The palace became her hunting ground. Senators came to pay respects to Claudius, but their eyes drifted to Messalina, who stood beside him with regal poise and a confidence that whispered danger. She was young, beautiful, politically connected, and now held the ear of the emperor, and Rome whispered. Some saw her as a stabilizing force. Others saw ambition glinting behind her smiles. But no one, absolutely no one, predicted just how far Messalina would take her new status. She had climbed to the top of Rome. Now the question was, would she rule beside Claudius, or rule instead of him? The answer would soon shake the empire. As soon as Messalina settled into life as empress, Rome began to buzz with rumours. Quiet at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Whether these stories were exaggerations or political smear campaigns didn't matter. What mattered was this. Messalina had become the most talked-about woman in the empire. And in Rome, being talked about was dangerous. Ancient writers, never known for subtlety, painted her as a woman of insatiable desire. But beneath the salacious gossip was something far more important. Her affairs were not simply lust. They were leverage. Each man she chose was politically useful. Senators, nobles, aristocrats, military men. Messalina understood that intimacy could build alliances faster than diplomatic letters ever could. Claudius, for all his administrative brilliance, was blind to it. He adored his wife with a soft, trusting devotion that bordered on vulnerability. Messalina leaned into that devotion, maintaining the perfect mask of loyalty while weaving her own web behind the scenes. Even her harshest critics admitted she knew how to perform innocence with a mastery worthy of a seasoned actress. Her influence expanded quietly at first. A friend gained a magistracy. A rival found himself suddenly out of favour. A family who had once dismissed her discovered their estates mysteriously confiscated. Each subtle shift in the political landscape tied back to Messalina, not through official decrees, but through whispered requests and strategic pillow talk. One of her earliest and most notorious entanglements was with Gaius Silius, a handsome and highly respected nobleman. Their relationship didn't erupt overnight, it simmered. What began as flirtation grew into a dangerous alliance. Silius was ambitious, wealthy, and admired by many. He was everything Claudius was not. And Messalina saw in him a potential partner, not just in pleasure, but in power. The pair became the centre of a hidden circle: patrician wives, ambitious husbands, disgruntled senators, a quiet opposition forming in the emperor's own palace, all orbiting around a woman who was still in her 20s. Meanwhile, Rome whispered louder. Some believed Messalina's affairs were harmless scandals. Others believed they were political manoeuvres. But a growing number began to fear the truth. Messalina wasn't just playing the role of empress, she was building a faction, a shadow court, an empire within the empire. And if Claudius noticed any of this, he didn't show it. But the storm was already gathering. By the time Messalina's relationship with Gaius Silius began to sharpen into something more than whispered scandal, Rome had already sensed a shift in the palace atmosphere. Silius was not a disposable lover. He was charismatic, wealthy, well-connected, and most importantly, ambitious. He wasn't interested in being a footnote in an empress's secret list of affairs. He wanted power. And Messalina, who had spent years watching older men underestimate her, recognized in Silius a partner who could actually keep up. In many ways, the match made a twisted kind of political sense. Claudius, for all his administrative skill, was not a commanding presence. He was beloved by the people, but not truly feared. Silius, on the other hand, radiated the kind of youthful confidence Romans adored. If Claudius represented stability, Silius represented possibility, and Messalina was caught between them, her official husband and her unofficial equal. The danger grew when Messalina began funneling influence, estates, and imperial attention towards Silius. Senators noticed. Noble families noticed. Even the Praetorian Guard, always alert to palace undercurrents, began asking quiet questions. Why was Silius's star rising so quickly? Who was protecting him? And why did so many of Messalina's allies suddenly find themselves indebted to this handsome young nobleman? Then came the rumours, hushed at first, then bolder. Some said Messalina and Silius plotted to remove Claudius. Others whispered that Silius wished to adopt young Britannicus, Claudius's son, as his own heir, a move so bold it bordered on treason. But the most terrifying rumour of all was the simplest. Messalina wanted to replace the emperor. No one knew how much of this Messalina actually intended. Ancient writers, many hostile to imperial women, enjoyed painting her as a scheming mastermind. The truth may have been more complex. Perhaps she sought more influence, not a coup. Perhaps she believed Claudius too easily swayed by advisers she despised. Perhaps she simply fell for Silius and let her desire cloud her judgment. Whatever her motives, the effect was the same. Silius became the lightning rod for all anxieties surrounding Messalina's power. And Silius himself made the fatal mistake of believing that his connection to Messalina made him untouchable. He strutted through Rome with an arrogance that set off alarm bells among the political elite. His confidence grew. His circle expanded. His ambitions sharpened. But Rome is a city where ambition, unchecked, becomes suicide. And Messalina's alliance with Silius was about to cross a line no one could survive. What happened next is one of the most shocking, unbelievable, and chaotic episodes in all of Roman imperial history. Even ancient historians, who loved exaggeration almost as much as they loved scandal, pause before describing it, because Messalina did something so outrageous, so dangerously bold, that generations of writers have argued over whether she was mad, overconfident, manipulated, or simply convinced she was untouchable. She married Gaius Silius, while still married to the emperor. This wasn't rumour. This wasn't gossip whispered behind palace curtains. This was a public ceremony, a full wedding complete with guests, vows, music, witnesses, and celebrations. The only thing missing was Claudius himself, blissfully unaware that his own wife was legally binding herself to another man in what can only be described as either delusion or the most audacious coup attempt in Roman history. The timing couldn't have been worse, or better, depending on how unhinged your ambitions were. Claudius was away from Rome, supervising religious ceremonies in Ostia Messalina, seeing an opening, decided to act. Some say she believed Claudius would quietly accept the situation to avoid humiliation. Others believe she intended to replace him entirely, with Silius ready to assume power and Britannicus as their political puppet. And some sources claim Silius pushed the idea, pressuring her to commit fully before Claudius could return. Regardless of motive, the wedding was no secret affair guests attended in droves, either out of loyalty, fear, opportunism, or morbid curiosity. They feasted. They toasted. They watched the Empress of Rome stand beside another man and swear lifelong devotion Saturn might have smiled at this level of chaos. But Rome certainly did not. The Praetorian Guard was stunned. Senators panicked. Palace officials whispered, "This is treason," while others whispered, "This is suicide." Even those who benefited from Messalina's patronage began quietly distancing themselves. The empire had tolerated her affairs. It had tolerated her political maneuvering. It had tolerated her influence over Claudius. But a public bigamous marriage? That crossed a line carved in marble. The ceremony wasn't just shocking, it was a declaration. Whether it was a genuine power grab or the fever dream of two lovers lost in their own ambitions, the message was unmistakable. There were now two emperors in Rome, and neither was Claudius. And when Claudius returned to the capital and learned the truth, the empire braced itself. Because the storm Messalina had created was about to crash down on her with fatal force. When Claudius returned from Ostia, he expected the usual: reports from advisors, routine imperial business, perhaps a quiet evening with his family. Instead, he was met at the city gates by terrified officials tripping over their own words. Their message was simple, blunt, and devastating. Your wife married another man. Claudius froze. The emperor who had survived palace coups, assassinations, and years of being mocked by his own family found himself struck silent. A mixture of disbelief, heartbreak, and political terror washed over him. Because this wasn't just adultery, something Rome tolerated with a shrug. This was treason, a direct threat to the imperial line. And Claudius, cautious by nature, understood immediately what this meant. Someone wanted him dead. His advisors rushed to fill the silence. Narcissus, his most trusted freedman, took charge. He explained everything: the wedding, the witnesses, the nobles who attended, the gifts exchanged, the rumours of plots, the speed with which Silius's circle had grown. Narcissus didn't soften the truth. He told Claudius exactly what Messalina and Silius had done, and Claudius cracked. First came confusion, then disbelief, then anger, raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. He demanded to know whether Britannicus, his own son, was safe. He demanded to know who else knew. He demanded to know whether the Praetorian Guard was loyal. Every question exposed another layer of betrayal, another barrier collapsing inside him. The emperor, who had loved his young wife with a tenderness rare in Roman politics, now realized she had publicly humiliated him before the entire empire. His next question was chilling. Am I still emperor? That single line reveals everything. Claudius wasn't just hurt. He feared he had already been replaced. Narcissus seized control. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to secure the palace, arrest Silius, and round up everyone who attended the wedding. Claudius, shaking with rage and humiliation, let him. For the first time in his reign, he allowed a subordinate to act without restraint. Meanwhile, Messalina, finally realizing that her fantasy world had collided with reality, panicked. She rushed out of the palace with a handful of loyal attendants, trying desperately to reach Claudius before Narcissus could poison him against her completely. She begged allies for protection. She cried, she pleaded. But doors that once opened for her now slammed shut. Rome sensed the shift instantly. Senators who had praised her a week ago now whispered prayers for their own safety. The people gossiped in the streets. The palace trembled with anticipation Claudius had returned, and Messalina's empire of influence was collapsing under its own weight. As Claudius prepared for a reckoning, Messalina entered the most desperate hours of her life. For years, she had moved through Rome with absolute confidence. Doors opened, senators smiled, allies swore loyalty, fortune bent in her favour. Now those same hallways echoed with dread. Allies vanished, friends looked away. Rome could smell blood, and no one wanted to be caught standing beside the doomed empress when the hammer fell. Messalina was still young, barely in her 20s, but she had risen so high that her fall felt mythic. She ran through the palace grounds, calling in every favour she could think of. She sent messages to Claudius. She summoned senators. She begged trusted courtiers to help her reach the emperor, before Narcissus could convince him that she was beyond forgiveness. She still believed she could fix it. She always had. But Rome had changed overnight. The marriage ceremony had not been a rumour. It was documented, witnessed, undeniable. And Silius, realizing that the tide had turned, made the most self-preserving decision he had ever made. He abandoned her. He fled to the Praetorian camp, hoping to negotiate or plead for mercy. It didn't work. The guard cut him down immediately, his ambition dying on the same blade that severed Messalina's last hope. Messalina didn't know this yet. She was still racing through the city, accompanied by a handful of loyal attendants and her mother, Lepida, who had not spoken to her in years, but returned now out of a mother's final instinct to shield her child. Together they fled the palace grounds, slipping into the gardens of the Villa Lucullus, hoping to hide until Claudius cooled. But Claudius wasn't cooling. Narcissus had carefully chosen the moment to strike, ensuring Messalina had no chance to appear before the emperor and manipulate him. Claudius, exhausted, humiliated, and overwhelmed, had allowed Narcissus to take control, and Narcissus knew what had to be done. Roman politics had no space for mercy towards someone who had publicly married another man in the emperor's absence. If Messalina survived, she would always remain a threat, a focal point for rebellion. So, Narcissus sent the soldiers. In the villa gardens, Messalina waited, trembling, furious, panicking, still convinced Claudius would summon her for a final audience. She rehearsed her speech. She imagined forgiveness. She imagined rebuilding. But the footsteps she heard approaching were not Claudius. They were the men sent to end her life. When the soldiers entered the lush gardens of the Villa Lucullus, carrying the emperor's unspoken verdict, the air itself seemed to freeze Messalina, once the untouchable empress of Rome, now stood trembling among the hedges and marble statues, a cornered animal in the same city she had once ruled through charm and cunning. She still clung to one final hope, that Claudius, the man who had adored her with blind devotion, would rescind the order at the last second. But Claudius was miles away, terrified and humiliated, and Narcissus made sure no message from Messalina would ever reach him. The soldiers hesitated. Killing an empress was no simple task. Some knew her, some had served her, some feared the wrath of the gods, but Narcissus had travelled with them to ensure the deed was done. He approached Messalina not with sympathy, but with cold efficiency. This wasn't personal. It was political survival. Messalina, in a final desperate attempt, tried to speak, plead, argue, explain, but the words tangled in her throat. Her mother, Lepida, who had reunited with her only in this last moment, held her and urged her to face death with dignity. "Your life is over," she whispered. "Do not make your death shameful." But Messalina couldn't do it. The young woman who had faced senators, generals, and palace intrigue without blinking now collapsed under the unbearable truth. She was going to die, and no one, not Claudius, not Silius, not the gods, was coming to save her. According to Roman historians, she was handed a dagger and told to end her own life, as noble Romans were expected to do. But Messalina, despite all her ambition and ruthlessness, was not a warrior. She couldn't steady her hand. She sobbed, trembling violently, unable to strike the woman who had commanded so much power, now discovered she could not command herself. In the end, a soldier stepped forward and did what she could not. The strike was swift. The garden fell silent. The empire exhaled. Messalina, Empress of Rome, was dead, her life ending not on a throne, but in the dirt of a borrowed garden. Clutching her mother's hand, Narcissus immediately sent word to Claudius. When the emperor heard the news, he showed no rage, no relief. He simply asked for wine and ate dinner, as if grief was something he could delay until morning. Rome, however, would never forget her. Because whether villain or victim, monster or masterpiece, Messalina had carved her name into imperial legend, with a ferocity no death could erase. When Messalina died, Rome didn't sigh with relief. It gossiped, it analysed, it exaggerated, it embroidered details until her life became less biography and more mythology. The true Messalina disappeared beneath layers of scandal, propaganda, and political convenience. What survived was a legend, a woman transformed into a symbol of everything dangerous, seductive, and chaotic about imperial Rome. Ancient historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal painted her as the ultimate villainess, promiscuous beyond reason, scheming beyond morality, and reckless beyond comprehension. But these writers also had agendas. They despised powerful women, they distrusted the imperial court, and they loved turning complicated figures into cautionary tales. So the question remains, who was Valeria Messalina really? One version of her is the monster, a young empress who weaponized beauty, destroyed rivals, manipulated her husband, and plotted a coup with her lover. This Messalina is the femme fatale of Roman nightmares, the woman who pushed excess to its breaking point and paid the ultimate price. Another version is the victim, a politically convenient scapegoat for Rome's anxieties about female influence. She was a young woman thrust into unimaginable power during a dynasty famous for paranoia and betrayal. Her mistakes, however real, were amplified by historians eager to vilify imperial women while excusing the sins of men. And then there is the third version, the one most historians quietly acknowledge today. Messalina was a product of her world, a world where politics was personal, sex was currency, alliances were fragile, and survival required a level of ruthlessness that modern minds can barely grasp. She played the same game as senators, generals, and emperors, only she played it from inside a gilded cage. Her death did not calm Rome. If anything, it exposed the palace's fragility. Claudius remarried quickly, choosing Agrippina the Younger, a woman even more ambitious and politically sharp than Messalina had ever been. Under Agrippina's guidance, Claudius eventually adopted Nero, setting the stage for another chapter of imperial chaos far darker than Messalina's scandals, and the Roman people. They remembered Messalina with a mix of fascination and horror. Plays mocked her. Poets whispered about her. Street sellers invoked her name to describe any woman who dared to reach above her station. But legends, especially scandalous ones, survive for a reason. Messalina represents the dangerous intersection of beauty and power, love and ambition, desire and politics. She reminds us that behind the marble and grandeur of imperial Rome lived real people capable of breathtaking brilliance and catastrophic mistakes. Whether she was villain, victim, or visionary, one truth endures. Messalina's story is pure Roman chaos, and Rome never forgot her.